In this tutorial, I'll show you how to create this barbecue hamburger meat patty in Blender. And then after we create the procedural material, I'll show you how to join the material together into this handy node group so you can customize the look of the hamburger material. So the custom node group will have many different settings like the overall size of the material. We also have the noise detail and the noise scale. And you can also control the meat color. You can also change the size of the cooked texture and also the cooked color. You can also just control the stripe scale and also the stripes color and also the stripes distortion. And you can also control the color of the edge of the hamburger. You can also change the roughness of the material and also the bump strengths and some displacement settings like the noise displacement strength and the stripes displacement strength and then just the overall displacement strength. And if you'd like to purchase this procedural material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. And you can also purchase all of my procedural materials by checking out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack. And my Ultimate Material Pack comes with all of my procedural materials, and they're pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. You can also check out my procedural material packs to purchase packs of 10 materials. And those are all great ways to help support this channel. And to learn how to create any of my materials, you can check out my procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. All the links are in the description. So I'll now show you my scene setup if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I have. So you can press Shift A, go here to Mesh, and I'm going to add a cylinder. Now when modeling to the real life scale in Blender, the default objects are quite large. They're a little bit larger than an average human. So I'm going to scale this object down. I'll type in 0.1 and then enter. So that way it is much more closer to the size of a hamburger patty. I'll also press Ctrl A and I can apply just the scale. So this is now the object's new default size. I'll also hit the Tab key to go into edit mode, and I'll scale the object down on the Z-axis so it's much more thin. Then I want to deselect everything. I'll click right up here to go to the vertex select, and I'm going to hold down the Alt key and just click here to select that loop. I'll press Ctrl B to add a bevel, put that there, and then Alt and click to select that loop, Ctrl B, add a bevel right there. Maybe even scale the entire thing up a bit on the Z-axis. So I can now go back to object mode, and over here on the side panel on the modifier properties, I'll click on add modifier and add the subdivision surface modifier. And I'm going to turn these up pretty high to like a 3. Now you can see there's a bit of stretching on the edges, so I'm going to hit the Tab key again to go into edit mode. Let's click here to go to the face select, and I'm going to select this face and then hold down the Shift key and select the bottom face. And I'll hit the I key to inset and just place there, and then I'll hit the I key again, and I'm just going to continue to do that many times until it is much smaller. Then I can go back to object mode, and here on the subsurf modifier, I'll click here on the drop down and click on apply to apply the subsurf, and then using the object context menu I can shade the object smooth. Now I'm going to want to add displacements to this object, so I do want it to be very detailed like this. However, the geometry isn't even. If I go into edit mode, you can see the geometry is super small right here in the center, and then right out here it's much bigger. So what I'll do to fix this is to just make sure the object is selected, and I'll click right up here, and I'm going to change this to sculpt mode. Then I can hit the R key, and the R key is going to change the size of the remesh, and I'll just make the remesh maybe about that big. Then you can press Ctrl R, and that is going to remesh the object. So if I click it here and go to edit mode, you can now see this is low poly, but the geometry is much more even. So I'll go back to object mode. And to make this object have much more geometry, let's click on add modifier, and we're going to add another subdivision surface. And then here on the viewport and render levels, I'm going to turn these both up to 3. Now if that's a bit laggy in the viewport, you can turn the levels of viewport down, but I will leave the viewport and render up to 3. Now another really important thing is to make sure that the origin point is in about the center of the object. So if I press the 1 on the numpad to go to front view, I just want to make sure that the origin point is about in the center of the hamburger meat patty. So it's about in the center up and down. And this is important because it's going to affect the gradient which we add later to the object. And then another thing you can do to make it look a bit more natural and organic is to go into edit mode, and you can press the O key to turn on the proportional editing. Then you can just select some of the faces and hit G to grab. You can use your scroll wheel to change the size of the proportional editing, and you can kind of just make the hamburger meat patty slightly random, so have some parts going up a little bit and other parts going down a little bit just to make it a bit more random and natural. So then I just rotated the hamburger meat patty kind of up here, kind of at an angle. And then I also added a camera, and I just pointed the camera at the meat patty. And to make the camera square, if you click here on the output properties, I just set the resolution to 1920 by 1920 and 200 resolution, so it's very high quality. And also with the camera selected, if you click here to the object data properties, I turned the focal length up to 80 just so that it zooms the camera in and makes everything look a bit more flat. Now as for the lighting, I added this area light right here. So if you press Shift A, you can go to light and you can add the area light, and I changed the shape to rectangle over here on the object data properties, and I changed the X size and the Y size so that there's this long light. And then I turned the power up to 6 and I made the color a slight yellow color. And I will hold down the Z button and move my mouse up to the rendered view to see this in the rendered mode. Now to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections, right over here on the world, I added in the Brick Factory 01. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. Link will be in the description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K HDR version. So after you download the HDRI, you can click here on the yellow dot next to color, and you can choose environment texture, and then just click on the open button and open up the HDRI. And I set the strength to 0.6 so it's not quite as bright. And then also to make the colors look a little bit nicer, you can go here to the render properties and you can open up the color management, and I'm using the view transform of filmic and the look to very high contrast to pop out the colors and make everything look saturated. So now let's go over the displacement settings. So if you want to use the material displacements, then you will need to be using the Cycles rendering engine. So we can now go to the shading workspace. So I'll click right up here on the shading workspace. I have the 3D viewport right here, and I have the shader editor right here. So I'll hit the 0 on the numpad to go into the camera view, and I'll hold down the Z button and go up into the rendered view, and I'll select this object, and let's click on new to add a new material. And I can just rename this material to hamburger meat patty. Now to get the displacements to work, we need to open up the side panel, and we need to click right down here on the material properties. And on this hamburger meat patty material, we need to go right down here to the settings, and we want to open up the settings and the surface, and here in the displacement we want to change the bump only to displacement and bump, and this is telling the material that it can use the displacements. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So to enable the Node Wrangler, just click here on edit, and you can go to the preferences, and over there on the add-ons tab just search for Node Wrangler, and you can check mark the Node Wrangler add-on. So to start off, I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'll search for a noise texture, and I'm just going to drop the noise texture here, and we're going to use this as the base texture for the hamburger meat. Also, because we turned on the Node Wrangler add-on, you can hold down the Control and Shift key and select different nodes, and that is going to preview the node on the object. Now you can see here on the edges, the noise is a bit stretched, so with the noise texture selected, I'll press Control T, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping, and I want to use the object coordinates, so let's put the object into the vector of the mapping, and now it's going to place the noise texture on the object more evenly. And then we can also change the noise texture settings. So I want to turn the scale way up, so I'll turn the scale to like 100. I also want to turn the detail up a bit, so I'll turn the detail to 10, but I don't want to turn the detail all the way up, because if I turn it all the way up, it's just gonna look very noisy, and I instead just want it to look a bit more lumpy. And then also here on the roughness, I will turn this to a 0.55. I can also click and drag to box select these nodes and drag them back, and with them selected, I'll press Control J, that is going to join them into a frame, and if I click on the frame, I will press F2 to add a label, and I will rename this to mapping, and that way it'll just keep my nodes nicely organized. Now for many of the things that I'll be using this noise texture for, I actually want to invert the colors, so I'll press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp here after the noise texture. And then I can click and drag, and I can switch these two tabs, so now the black is over here and the white is over here. So you can see now we've basically just inverted the texture. So I now want to create a gradient on the edge, because the very front of the burger is going to be a bit more cooked, and you're going to see those stripes from the barbecue. However, the side of the burger is going to be a slightly different color, and it won't be cooked quite as much. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'll search for a gradient texture. I can drop this up up here, and I'll Control Shift and select the gradient texture to preview it. And I can take the mapping vector here and let's put that into the vector of the gradient texture. Now I want to transform the gradient texture, so I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I can search for another mapping node, and let's put this mapping node here in between the first mapping and the gradient. So now this mapping can be used to change just the gradient texture. So what I first want to do is move the gradient over a bit so you can see it better. So here on this location X, I can drag this around and that'll move it around. So I'll turn the location X to just a value of 0.1 so you can see it much better. And then I want to rotate it so the gradient is on the side. So I can take the rotation Y value, I can rotate this and it'll rotate the gradient. So I'll turn the rotation Y value to 90. So you can see it's lighter up here and then it's darker down there. I also want to scale the gradient to kind of squish it down because it's very gray and kind of hard to see. So right here on the scale Z, you can see if I scale this up, it'll kind of squish it down. So I'll turn the scale Z to 5. So I now want to have it just be lighter on the sides. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for another color ramp, and let's put the color ramp after this gradient texture. So I can now drag the white tab over, and then I can also drag the black tab over a bit, and I'll drag that over, and I'll hold down the Control key and click here to add another tab. And then if I click on the color to change this, I'm going to make this a very dark color. And then I will drag it over so you can see because we have a black tab and then a white tab and then a black tab, it's now black here, then it's white, and then it's black. I also want to make this white tab just slightly more gray because if it's more gray, then it will be a little bit more faded. So if I click here on the white tab, I can turn this down just a little bit. And if you want to use the exact same gray color that I'll be using, you can click on the hex value and you can punch in E5, E5, E5. Now I want to make this a bit more sharp, so I'm actually going to hold down the Control key and click here again to add another tab so that there are two gray tabs. And I'm going to have these two gray tabs to be the exact same color, so I'll click on this gray tab here, click on the color, and again I'll punch in the same hex value of E5, 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 so that they're the same color. And if you're having problems with the gradient not being in the center, make sure that the origin point of the object is about in the center up and down along the hamburger patty. Now I want the edges of the gradient to be a little bit more noisy and random. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'll search for the mix color node, and let's just drop this up here. So I want to put this mix color node in between the color ramp and the gradient texture, so just drop it here. And then if I click on the mix here to change the type, I want to change this to a linear light. So I can now take this noise texture factor and we can mix that into color B, and then the gradient is going to be going into color A. So now we can drag the factor, and if we turn the factor to 0, it's just using the gradient, but then as I turn the factor up, this noise texture is going to distort the gradient more and more. So if I turn it all the way up, it's super noisy, but if I turn it down, it's only going to be slightly noisy. So I'm going to turn the factor to a very small number of 0.07, so you can still see the gradient, but it is a bit noisy on the edges. And then if you need to, you can adjust the color ramp if it got moved around a bit. So I'm now going to click and drag to box select these nodes, and then I will press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame just to keep my nodes nicely organized. And with the frame selected, I'll press F2, and I'm going to rename this to Edge Gradient. So I now want to create the texture for the little cooked areas. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'll search for another noise texture, and let's drop this up here. And then I want to use the same mapping, so I'll drag the mapping back, and I'll take the vector, and I'll put that into the vector of the noise texture. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And let's change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale up to like a 50, I'll also turn the detail to the maximum of 15, and I want to add a bit more roughness, so I'll just turn the roughness up to like a 0.6. Now this is a little bit gray and I want it to be more contrasty, so I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we'll put the color ramp after this noise texture. So I can now drag these tabs together, and what I actually want to do is flip them. So I'll drag the black tab over here and the white tab I'll drag to about here, and you can see now that they're very close to each other, it's much more contrasty. So that is going to be the cooked texture. So I will click and drag to box select these nodes, and again I'll press Ctrl J to join it together into a frame, and I'll select the frame and press F2, and I'm going to rename this to Cooked Texture. So I now want to create the barbecue striped texture on the meat patty. So to do this, I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a wave texture, and let's drop this down here, and I can Control Shift and select the wave texture to preview it. And then I want to use the same mapping, so let's take the vector and we'll put that into the vector of the wave texture. And then I want to change some of the settings, so I want to see more of the barbecue stripes, so I'll turn the scale up to like a 9. And then I'll turn the distortion up a little bit so it's a bit more random, so I'll turn the distortion to 2. But then I don't want it to be too detailed, so I'll just leave the detail level at 2. However, I will turn the detail scale up a little bit, so I'll turn that up to 2 as well. You can see there's a little bit more detail on the edges. Now this detail roughness here, I do want to turn this up a little bit, so I'll turn it up to like a 0.6. Now I want these stripes to be a little bit thicker, so I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp. Let's click on the color ramp and I'll drop it here after the wave texture. And then to make these a little bit thicker, I just want to hold down the control key and click right about here to add a tab. And then if I click on this color, I want to make this a darker color, and you can see now that it's darker, it's a bit thicker on those edges. And the exact color that I'll be using, if you go to the hex value, you can punch in A3, A3, A3. So that's the gray color that I'll be using. So I'll now click and drag to box select these nodes, and I'll press Ctrl J and I'll click on the frame, and I can press F2 and I'll rename this to stripes texture. Alright, so we now have all of these different textures, and I want to start to mix them together to actually create the hamburger meat patty. So I'm going to start by mixing the noise and the stripes together. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix color. Let's drop this here, and I can Control Shift and select it to preview it. Now I just want to add the dark values because I basically just want to add the dark parts of the noise into the stripes. So let's click on the mix here, and I can change it to darken so it adds the dark values. So now I can take this color ramp here and let's put this into color A, and then this stripes textures here, let's put the color into value B. So now it's just adding the dark values, so as I turn this up, you can see it's going to add the stripes on top of the noise. So I'll turn the factor all the way up to 1. So I now want to create the main 2 colors for the meat patty. So I'll click on this darken here, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it here after the first one. And then I can click on the darken and I want to set it back to mix. And then I want to take the result here and I can put this into the factor. So the factor is determining where it's going to be color A and where it's going to be color B. And why I'm doing this here instead of just changing these colors on the color ramp is because I want to be able to control these colors outside of the node group. So now let's make the 2 colors, and I'll first make the barbecue stripe colors. So here on A, I'm going to make this kind of a reddish orangey color, but then I'm going to make it very dark. And the hex value that I'll be using here on color A is going to be 190E09 if you want to use the same color that I'm using. And then this color here, this is going to be the meat color. So let's make this kind of an orangey color and then make it a bit darker so it is brown. And the hex value that I'll be using here on color B is going to be 623620. So I now want to mix in the edge gradient to this color. So I'll click and drag to select these nodes and I'll move them back. And then I want to click on this mix. I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it here after this one. And then I want to take the gradient edge color here from the color ramp, and I'm going to pull out a wire and stick that into the factor of this mix. And then this mix here, this is just going to go into color A. So you can see now color B is going to be the colors of the edges. So I want to click on the color here, and I want to make this a bit lighter and a bit less saturated and a bit less red. And the hex value for the edge color here on color B, if you go to the hex value, you can punch in 6E4F39. That's the exact color that I'll be using. And if you want to, you can adjust the color ramp a little bit. So back here on this color ramp, if you want to, you can kind of change the color ramp. So change where the tabs are. So like right over here, I might want to pull these back just slightly. And then right here, if I go to the bottom, I might want to pull the black tab over just slightly so it's a little less contrasty. All right, so let's go back here to the mix, and I want to mix in the last group of textures, which is the cooked texture. So I'll click on the mix here, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I can drop it here after this one. And let me just bring the principled shader out of the way. So I want this mix result to be going into color A, and then I want to go right up here to the cooked texture, and I want to put the color into the factor. So that's determining where it's going to be color A and where it's going to be color B. So now here on color B, this is going to be the cooked color. So if I click on color B, I'll make this pretty red and brown, and I'll make it very dark. And the color here for color B is going to be 0D0302. So that is the final base color for the material. So I can take the result and I'll put that into the base color of the shader, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now because this is meat, I want to add a little bit of subsurface scattering to make it look a bit more organic and natural and let a little bit of light to go through the material. So here on this subsurface value, I'm going to turn this to a very small number of 0.003. So there's just a tiny bit of subsurface. And then here on the subsurface color, I want to make this a red color because this is hamburger meat. So I'm going to make it a very bright red color. And the hex value that I'll be using for the subsurface color will be DA1500. Now I also want there to be a little bit of variation in the roughness, so let's go here to this noise texture color ramp. We're going to take this color ramp color, let's pull out a wire and put this here into the roughness. But then I want to be able to control the roughness values, so I'll press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'll search for another color ramp, and let's put this here before the roughness. So now I can make the colors lighter and darker to control the roughness. So on this color ramp here, I'll take the black tab, and I'm going to turn this up a bit, and you can see if I turn this up and it's more gray, it's going to be a bit more rough. So I'm going to turn this to kind of like a dark gray, and the exact color that I'll be using will be a hex value of 2A, 2A, 2A. So you can see it still is pretty shiny, and that'll make it look like some juicy cooked meat. Now later on when we create the custom node group, I do want to be able to control the roughness. So an easy way to do this is to press Shift A and go to the search, and we can search for the hue saturation value, and let's put this in between the color ramp and the roughness. So the hue saturation value has this value right here, and so if you turn this up, it's going to make it lighter or darker, and so that'll make it more rough and more shiny. So we'll use this later in the custom node group. So this hamburger patty is not very bumpy, so let's add some data into the normal to give it some bump. So I'm first going to take this color ramp color and let's pull out a wire and put this into the normal, but then we need to convert this to normal data because there's some weird shading issues. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the bump node, and let's put the bump node here before it goes into the normal. And then we actually want the color ramp color to be going into the height value of the bump, and that way it'll convert it to normal data so you can see it is very bumpy. And it is a bit too bumpy, so I'll just turn the strength down to like a 0.2. Now I also want to add the cooked texture into the bump. So let's go back here to the bump. I'll click on the bump and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and we can put it here after the first one. So the normal can go through the normal, so we now have an extra height value that we can add data into. So let's go here to the cooked texture. We can take the color from the color ramp, and I can pull out a wire, drag this down, and I'll put this into the height value of the bump. So this is definitely starting to look like hamburger meat, but I want there to be a little bit of displacement so that the edges are a bit bumpy, and also where the barbecue grill cooked the meat a little bit more, I want that to be going down in a little bit. So I'm first going to press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm just going to search for a noise texture, and we'll use this to create the noise for the displacement. I can also take this mapping here, and let's bring out a wire and put this here into the vector of the noise texture so that it's using the object coordinates. And I can control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. Now you can see that there is this wire which is overlapping the other nodes, so I'm going to hold down the Shift key and right click and drag over the wire, and that is going to add a reroute, and I can just drag the reroute back here just to keep the nodes nicely organized. So then here on this noise texture, let's change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale up to like a 40, and then I do want some detail but not too much because I don't want it to look too noisy. I want it to look a little bit lumpy. So I'm going to turn the detail to just a 4. So I now want to mix this noise texture in with the stripes texture. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'll search for the mix color, and let's drop the mix color right here, and then I want to put the noise texture factor into color B. Then here on color A, I can take the stripes texture color ramp, and let's put the color into color A. And then I can control Shift and select the mix to preview it. So now if I drag the factor around, you can see it's mixing in between the two textures, and so we can use this to control how bumpy we want the waves to be. So to actually preview this in the displacement, let's take the result, and I can put that into the displacement of the material output. And I can control Shift and select the principled shader. Now if you zoom way out, you can see it's stretching and kind of going off to the side, and that's because we need to convert the color data into displacement data. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the displacement displacement node, and let's put this here between the mix and the displacement. And I can drag this right over here. Now you can see something is still wrong, and that is because we need to take the result and we need to put that into the height value of the displacement. And now it actually is converting it to displacement data. Now if for some reason the displacement still isn't working for you, then you need to go right here to the material properties, and you need to scroll down here to the settings and open up the surface, and you need to make sure this material's displacement setting is set to displacement and bump. And if you don't have this setting, that's because you need to make sure you're using the cycles rendering engine. So here on the render properties, make sure you're using cycles because the material displacements are not supported in Eevee. So we now have the scale value, and we can turn this way down. So I'll make it much smaller to just like a 0.1 so you can kind of see what it's doing. So you can see now it is bumping out those waves. Now I want this to be even less strong, so I'm going to turn the scale value to like a 0.013, just a 0.013, so it's much less strong. So now I can go back here to this mix and I can drag the factor, and you can see the factor is going to control how bumpy the waves are. So I'm going to turn the factor to like a 0.9 so that those waves are just bumping out a little bit, but it is pretty subtle. Now if I go back real quick and turn the factor down, you can see the shape of the wave, and I actually don't really like the shape of the wave. I want it to be a little bit more flat and a little bit larger as well. So I'll press Shift A, and I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the RGB curves. And let's drop this here, and I want to take the RGB curves and I want to put it in between the stripes texture and the mix. So just drop it here, and I can drag this mix over. I can also drag the RGB curves right here, and then I'll put the noise texture just next to it. So we can now use the RGB curves to actually change the shape of the wave. So I'm going to click here to add a dot in the RGB curves, and I'm going to drag this up, and you can see now it is looking much more circular. So this shape here on the RGB curves, that is going to determine the shape of the wave bump. I'm also going to click here to add another dot and maybe bring this down a little bit, and I can click here to add another dot and maybe bring this down just a little bit. But now you can see that shape looks much better, but it is still way too strong, so I'll just turn the factor way up to like a 0.9 again. Alright, so then if you want to organize the nodes very nicely, you can click and drag to box select these nodes. You can press Ctrl J, and I'll click on the frame and press F2, and I'm going to call this displacement. And there we have it. So there is the procedural hamburger meat patty material. So I'll now show you how to join this together into a custom node group. So I'm going to click and drag to box select all these nodes except the material output. And then if you press Ctrl G, that will join them together into a node group. And then if you press the N key will open up the side panel here, and you can see there will be inputs and outputs, and make sure you click on the group tab to see the inputs and outputs. Now here on the outputs, I want to double click on the BSDF, and I want to rename this to shader because I just like that a bit better. And then if you hit the tab key, that's going to go in and out of the node group. So I'm going to drag the node group right over here, and I can also drag it out to make it a bit bigger. And then if I click here on the name, I'll copy this with Ctrl C. I can click on the node group name and press Ctrl V to paste the name. So it's called Hamburger Meat Patty. And then I will select the node group and hit the tab key to go into the node group. Now right over here, you can see there is a group input, and we can plug values up to the group input to control it outside of the node group. So let's take the mapping scale. This mapping is plugged up to all the textures, so we can change the scale to change the size of the entire material. So let's put the scale into the group input, and then if I click here on the inputs, I want to click on this and go down here to type, and instead of it being vector, I want to change it to float so that it is just one single value. And then right here on the default value, we need to turn this back to 1. So let's turn the default to 1. And then you can see there still isn't any texture. That's because we need to go outside of the node group. We need to turn the scale back to 1. And then we can hit the tab key to go into the node group again. Now I want to control the noise detail and the noise scale. So I'm going to drag the group input right over here to this main noise texture. And let's take this detail. I can put that into the extra socket. And then if I double click on this to rename it, I'll rename it to noise detail. Then we also have this scale right here, and I'll put the scale into the group input right there, and then I'll rename this one to noise scale. Then I want to be able to control the meat color, so let's take the group input and I can drag it right over here above these mix nodes, and this color right here, this is going to be the meat color, so let's put that into the extra socket, and then if I click on this, I will rename it to meat color. Then I want to control the cooked scale, so I will drag this right up here, drag the group input up here, and this noise texture is the cooked texture. So let's put the scale into the extra socket here, and then I can rename this, and I'll rename it to cooked scale. Then I want to be able to control the cooked color, so let's drag the group input right back here, and this mix right here, this black tab, that is the cooked parts. So let's take color B, put that into the extra socket, and then if I click here to rename this, I'll rename this to cooked color. Then I want to be able to control the size of the barbecue grill stripes, so I will drag the group input down here, and we can take the wave texture scale, let's put that into the extra socket, and I can rename this to stripes scale. Then I want to control the stripes color, so if I go right up here, you can see this mix node has this dark color, and that is controlling the stripes color. So let's take a wire out of color A, I'll drag this over, and I can put this here into the extra socket, and then I can rename this to stripes color. Then I want to be able to control the distortion of the stripes if I want to make them more random. So I'll take the distortion here from the wave, and I can put that here into the extra socket, and then I can rename this to stripes distortion. Then I want to control the edge color, so just the color of the meat on the edge. So we can take this last color right here on this mix, I'll pull out a wire, I can drag this over here, and I'll stick it into this extra socket. And then if I double click on this to rename it, I'll rename this to edge color. Then I want to control the roughness of the material, so we can go over here to the hue saturation value, and this value will make it lighter or darker. So I'll take the value, I can drag this over, and I'll put this into the extra socket, and I can double click on this, and I'll rename this one to roughness. Then I want to control the bump strength, so I can take the group input and I'll drag it right over here behind these bumps. And I'll take the first bump and put that into the extra socket, and then the second bump and I'll put that into the extra socket. Now this bump here, this one is being controlled by this noise, so this is the noise bump strength. So if I click here on the first one, double click on this, I'll rename this one to noise bump strength. And then the second one, if I double click on this to rename this, I'll rename it to cooked bump strength. Then I want to be able to control the size of the noise displacement. So this noise texture right here in the displacement, we can put the scale into the extra socket, and I'll rename this one to noise displacement scale. Then I want to be able to control the strength of the stripes displacement. So that is controlled with this factor here. So let's put this into the extra socket, and I'm going to rename this one to stripes displacement strength. And then finally, I want to be able to control just the overall displacement strength. So we have this displacement scale right here. So let's drag this over. I can put that into the extra socket. And this last value I'll rename to displacement strength. So I can press the N key to close the side panel. I'll click on the group input and I'll just drag it like right about there. And then I can hit the tab key to go outside of the node group. And there we have it. So there is the finished procedural material. So we have the overall scale, we have the noise detail and the noise scale. We also have many different colors like the meat color and like the stripes color. We can also change the size of the stripes. So if you want many more of those barbecue grill stripes, you can turn that up. There's also the roughness, and there's also some bump strengths, and then 3 different displacement strengths. So I hope you enjoyed creating this material, and I hope you find it helpful, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel and purchase the material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. You can also check out my procedural material packs to purchase all of my materials, and to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. And some great ways to help support me here on YouTube is by checking out the YouTube memberships by clicking down there on that join button next to the subscribe button. And you can also use the super thanks feature here on YouTube to send me a little tip if you enjoyed this tutorial. But I hope you found this helpful, and thanks for watching.